Ma'am, I'm going to need to see proof of insurance before we can proceed with any services. The receptionist's voice cut through the waiting room like a blade, loud enough for every parent and child within earshot to hear. I looked up from the clipboard I'd been filling out, my pen hovering over the emergency contact section. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, casting harsh shadows across the cramped family clinic waiting room. 23 years of military service, 2 tours in Afghanistan, a medical degree earned through night classes while stationed in Germany, and this 19-year-old behind the front desk was treating me like I couldn't afford a simple flu shot. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What happened next would remind an entire clinic that respect isn't something you earn based on your appearance, and sometimes the person you're dismissing has spent decades defending the very freedom that allows you to speak so carelessly. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in Cedar Falls, Iowa. I'd driven my 15-year-old Honda Civic to the Riverside Family Health Clinic, the closest place to get a flu shot before my upcoming deployment to Kuwait. The October air was crisp, leaves crunching under my worn sneakers as I walked across the parking lot. I wasn't wearing my uniform. I rarely did on my days off. Instead, I had on faded jeans, a plain gray sweatshirt from my college days, and the kind of practical shoes that come from years of prioritizing function over fashion. The clinic itself was nothing special, a converted strip mall space wedged between a nail salon and a tax preparation office. The kind of place that served working families, people without fancy insurance, folks who needed affordable health care. I'd chosen it specifically because I believed in supporting community medicine, the places that served everyone regardless of their ability to pay. Inside, the waiting room buzzed with the controlled chaos of a busy medical practice. Mothers juggled toddlers while filling out forms. Elderly patients sat quietly, some reading outdated magazines, others simply staring at the television mounted in the corner. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the faint aroma of someone's coffee created that distinct clinical atmosphere I knew so well from my own medical training. I approached the front desk where a young woman with bleached blonde hair and rhinestone-studded glasses looked up from her computer screen. Her name tag read Brittany in cheerful purple letters. She gave me a practiced smile, the kind that was professionally polite but didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hi there, what can I help you with today?" she asked, already reaching for a clipboard. "I'd like to get a flu shot, please," I replied, accepting the form she handed me. "Perfect, just fill these out completely, front and back, and bring them up when you're done. We'll need to see your insurance card, too." I nodded and found a seat in the corner near the window. The morning sun streamed through the glass, warming my face as I began working through the paperwork. Standard stuff: name, address, date of birth, medical history. Under occupation, I simply wrote military. Under emergency contact, I listed my sister Sarah back in Minneapolis. As I filled out the forms, I couldn't help but overhear the conversations around me. A mother was explaining to her young son why he needed to be brave during his checkup. An elderly man was discussing his medications with his wife, their voices soft but concerned. A teenage girl sat across from me, nervously fidgeting with her phone while her father filled out her paperwork. I'd almost finished when I heard Brittany's voice rise above the general murmur of the waiting room. She was speaking to a woman at the front desk, a middle-aged Latina woman holding the hand of a small boy who couldn't have been more than 5. "I'm sorry, but without proof of insurance or payment up front, we can't see patients today," Brittany was saying, her voice carrying an edge of impatience. The woman's English was accented but clear. "Please, my son has been coughing for 3 days. I have the money, I just forgot my insurance card at home. I can call them, verify the information over the phone." "Ma'am, I understand, but we have policies for a reason. You'll need to come back with proper documentation." I watched the interaction unfold, feeling a familiar knot form in my stomach. The little boy pressed closer to his mother, sensing her distress even if he didn't understand the conversation. The woman's shoulders sagged, and I could see her calculating the time it would take to drive home, find the insurance card, and return. Time her sick child didn't have. "Excuse me," I found myself saying, standing up and walking toward the desk. I couldn't help but overhear. I'm a doctor. Would you mind if I took a quick look at your son? Brittany's head snapped toward me, her expression immediately hardening. Ma'am, we don't allow non-staff to examine patients. Besides, even if you were a doctor, which, she paused, her eyes scanning my casual clothes, seems unlikely, we still have policies to follow. The dismissal in her voice was unmistakable. I felt the familiar burn of being underestimated, the same feeling I'd experienced countless times throughout my military career. A woman, especially one who didn't look the part of authority, was often assumed to be less capable, less credible, less worthy of respect. I understand, I replied calmly. I was just offering to help. Well, you can help by filling out your own forms and waiting your turn like everyone else, Brittany replied, her voice taking on a sharp edge that seemed to put me in my place. I returned to my seat, but I couldn't focus on the paperwork anymore. The woman with the sick child had given up and was heading toward the door, her son's small hand still clasped in hers. I watched them leave, knowing that child would probably spend another day suffering while his mother scrambled to gather the bureaucratic requirements necessary for basic medical care. 20 minutes later, I approached the front desk again with my completed forms. Brittany looked them over quickly, then held out her hand expectantly. Insurance card? I reached into my wallet and pulled out my military medical card, the one that had served me faithfully through countless duty stations and deployments. Brittany took it, turned it over in her hands, and frowned. "This isn't a regular insurance card," she said, holding it up as if it might be counterfeit. "It's military medical coverage," I explained. "TRICARE. It should be accepted here." Brittany's frown deepened. She walked over to an older woman behind the desk, someone who appeared to be a supervisor based on the way other staff members deferred to her. They had a whispered conversation, occasionally glancing in my direction. I could see the supervisor shaking her head, her expression skeptical. Brittany returned to her station and looked at me with barely concealed irritation. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see proof of insurance before we can proceed with any services." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Around me, the waiting room had grown quieter. Other patients were watching now, some trying to be discreet, others openly staring. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from anger. After everything I'd given to this country, after years of serving in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, I was being treated like a fraud trying to scam a $20 flu shot. "This is my proof of insurance," I said, pointing to the military medical card she'd just handed back to me. "I'm active duty military." "This card guarantees payment." "Well, we've never seen one of these before, and we're not comfortable accepting it without verification from our billing department. They won't be in until tomorrow." "You want me to come back tomorrow for a flu shot?" "That would be best, yes. Or you could pay cash up front. The flu shot is $65 plus a $20 administrative fee plus the office visit charge of $40. So that would be $125 total." I stared at her, processing not just the inflated cost, but the obvious attempt to price me out of service. A flu shot that cost Medicare $12 was somehow worth $65 here, but only if you looked like you couldn't afford to question it. "Let me speak to someone else," I said, my voice still calm, but carrying an edge that anyone who'd served under me would recognize. "I am the someone else you speak to about billing issues," Brittany replied, her chin lifting defiantly. "Unless you'd like to make an appointment to come back tomorrow with proper documentation." The waiting room had gone completely silent now. A toddler's babbling seemed unnaturally loud in the tension-filled space. I could feel 24 pairs of eyes on me, waiting to see how this would play out. Would I back down? Would I cause a scene? Would I simply leave, another person dismissed by a system that seemed designed to humiliate as much as heal? I thought about my options. I could pull out my phone and call my commanding officer, who could verify my military status in 30 seconds. I could demand to speak to the clinic manager or physician on duty. I could even pay the ridiculous cash fee and write it off as the cost of avoiding confrontation. But something deeper was at stake here. This wasn't just about my flu shot. This was about the woman with the sick child who'd been turned away. This was about every person who'd ever been made to feel small by bureaucratic power plays and prejudiced assumptions. This was about a principle that went beyond the inconvenience of any single interaction. "Fine," I said, finally. I pulled out my wallet and counted out $125 in 20s and 5s, placing them on the counter with deliberate precision. Brittany swept up the money with barely concealed satisfaction, as if my compliance proved her point about people like me. "Thank you. Have a seat and we'll call you when the nurse is ready." I returned to my corner seat, my jaw clenched tight. The other patients had returned to their magazines and phones, the drama apparently over. But across the room, near the children's play area, I noticed a woman watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She was younger than me, maybe early 30s, dressed in scrubs with a hospital badge clipped to her shirt. Not a staff member here, probably someone getting medical care before her own shift started. Our eyes met for a moment, and she gave me a small nod that seemed to say she'd witnessed what happened and didn't approve of it either. Then she returned to her phone, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. "Rebecca Hayes," a voice called from the door leading to the examination rooms. I stood and followed a nurse down a short hallway lined with motivational posters about healthy eating and exercise. The examination room was small and sterile, dominated by the paper-covered table that crinkled every time I shifted position. The nurse, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair, took my vital signs with practiced efficiency. "Dr. Morrison will be with you shortly," she said, and I could hear genuine warmth in her voice that had been absent from my front desk interaction. I sat alone in the room, listening to the muffled sounds of the clinic beyond the thin walls. Doors opening, distant conversations, the occasional cry of a child. I thought about the deployment I was preparing for, my third tour in a combat zone. 3 weeks from now, I'd be treating wounded soldiers in a field hospital where the greatest concern was saving lives, not processing insurance claims. The irony wasn't lost on me. In Afghanistan, I'd operated on patients whose lives hung by threads, making split-second decisions about care without ever asking about their ability to pay. But here, in the country I'd sworn to defend, a simple preventative vaccine had become a test of my worthiness for basic respect. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts, and the door opened to reveal a man in his late 40s wearing a white coat over khakis and a blue button-down shirt. His hair was graying at the temples, and he carried himself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Good morning. I'm Dr. Morrison," he said, extending his hand. "I understand you're here for a flu shot today." "That's right," I replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, professional. "Any allergies or reactions to vaccines in the past?" "None." "Current medications?" "None." "Any recent illness or fever?" "No." He nodded, making notes on his tablet. "This should be pretty straightforward then. Let me just get the vaccine prepared." Dr. Morrison moved with the efficient motions of someone who'd given thousands of vaccinations. He prepared the injection site on my upper arm, and I barely felt the needle go in. As he disposed of the syringe and applied a small bandage, he asked casually, "What do you do for work?" "I'm in the military," I replied. He paused in his cleanup, looking at me with new interest. "Active duty?" "Yes, 23 years of service." "Impressive. What's your role?" "I'm a doctor, emergency medicine, currently preparing for deployment to Kuwait." Dr. Morrison's hands stilled completely. He turned to face me fully, his expression shifting from polite professionalism to something approaching disbelief. "You're a physician?" "Yes." "In the military?" "Colonel, actually. Colonel Rebecca Hayes, United States Army Medical Corps." The color drained from Dr. Morrison's face. He set down his tablet and ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking older than his years. "Colonel Hayes," he repeated slowly, as if testing the words. "And my staff? At the front desk? They treated me like I was trying to defraud them for a flu shot, yes." Dr. Morrison closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, I could see genuine mortification there. "Colonel, I am so deeply sorry. What happened out there is completely unacceptable." "It happens more often than you'd think," I replied, Not without kindness. People make assumptions based on appearance. That's no excuse. None at all. He was quiet for a moment, clearly wrestling with something. Colonel Hayes, would you mind waiting here for just a few minutes? There's something I need to address immediately. I nodded, and he stepped out of the room, closing the door behind him. Through the thin walls, I could hear his voice in the hallway, speaking in urgent, clipped tones to someone on staff. The conversation was too muffled to make out specific words, but the tension was unmistakable. A few minutes later, Dr. Morrison returned, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood Brittany from the front desk, her face pale and her earlier confidence completely evaporated. The supervisor I'd seen earlier was there too, looking equally uncomfortable. "Colonel Hayes," Dr. Morrison began, his voice formal and clear, "I've just learned about the treatment you received at our front desk this morning, and I want to address it immediately and publicly." He stepped aside, gesturing for me to follow him back toward the waiting room. I wasn't sure what he had in mind, but something in his demeanor suggested this wasn't going to be a quiet, private conversation. We walked through the hallway and back into the waiting room, which was still busy with patients. Dr. Morrison moved to the center of the space, his presence immediately commanding attention from everyone present. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "I need everyone's attention for just a moment." Conversation stopped. Parents looked up from their children. Elderly patients set down their magazines. The room fell silent, all eyes focused on the doctor in the white coat. "This morning, one of our patients was treated with disrespect and skepticism by our front desk staff," Dr. Morrison continued. "This patient was questioned about her insurance, charged excessive cash fees, and made to feel unwelcome in our clinic. I felt my cheeks burn as every eye in the room turned toward me. This wasn't what I had expected or wanted. I'd come for a simple flu shot, not to become the center of a public spectacle." "That patient," Dr. Morrison said, his voice growing stronger, "is Colonel Rebecca Hayes of the United States Army Medical Corps. She has served our country for 23 years, including multiple deployments in combat zones where she has saved countless lives. She is currently preparing for another deployment, this time to Kuwait, where she will once again put herself in harm's way to serve others." The silence in the room was now complete, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning system. I could see shock registering on faces throughout the waiting room. The woman in scrubs that I'd noticed earlier was watching with an expression of satisfaction, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. "Colonel Hayes," Dr. Morrison continued, turning to face me directly, "on behalf of Riverside Family Health Clinic, I offer you our deepest and most sincere apologies. What happened here today was wrong, unprofessional, and completely contrary to the values we claim to uphold." He paused, and then, to my complete astonishment, Dr. Morrison came to attention and rendered a crisp, formal salute. "Thank you for your service, Colonel." The effect was immediate and profound. Across the waiting room, I saw people straightening in their chairs. The woman in scrubs stood up. An elderly man wearing a Vietnam veteran's baseball cap struggled to his feet and brought his weathered hand to his chest in a shaky salute. One by one, others began to stand as well, until nearly the entire waiting room was on their feet. I stood there, overwhelmed by the unexpected display of respect and recognition. This wasn't what I had come for. I'd simply wanted a flu shot and to be treated with basic human dignity. But somehow, in the span of 30 minutes, a routine medical visit had become something much larger. I stood there in the center of that waiting room, surrounded by faces I'd never seen before, feeling the weight of their respect like a physical force. The elderly veteran with the baseball cap held his salute steady, despite the tremor in his hand, his eyes bright with tears he was trying not to shed. A young mother had lifted her toddler onto her hip, whispering something in his ear that made him wave his chubby hand in my direction. Even the teenager who'd been glued to her phone earlier was standing now, her device forgotten in her lap. Dr. Morrison lowered his hand, but maintained his rigid posture, the formal respect of his salute still radiating through his bearing. Behind him, Brittany looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Her face had gone from pale to a splotchy red, and her hands trembled as she clutched her clipboard against her chest. The supervisor, an older woman whose name tag read Margaret, kept opening and closing her mouth as if searching for words that wouldn't come. "Please," I said, quietly, gesturing for everyone to sit down. "Thank you, but that's really not necessary." But the moment had taken on a life of its own. The woman in scrubs, the one I'd noticed watching the earlier confrontation, stepped forward from her position near the children's area. She was younger than I'd initially thought, perhaps in her late 20s, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to high-pressure situations. "Excuse me, Dr. Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the authority of medical training. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen from Cedar Falls Memorial. I was here getting my own flu shot before my shift." She paused, looking directly at me. "Colonel Hayes, I witnessed everything that happened at the front desk earlier, and I want you to know that several of us have already contacted the clinic's patient advocacy board." Dr. Morrison's expression shifted from embarrassment to concern. "Dr. Chen, I appreciate your involvement, but—" "No," Dr. Chen interrupted firmly. "What happened here today isn't just about poor customer service. This is about systematic bias in healthcare delivery. Colonel Hayes was profiled, discriminated against, and financially exploited based on assumptions about her appearance and background." She turned to address the room more broadly. "How many other patients have been treated this way? How many people have been turned away or overcharged because they didn't look like they belonged here?" A murmur rippled through the waiting room. I could see recognition dawning on several faces, the uncomfortable acknowledgement that they'd probably witnessed similar incidents but hadn't spoken up. The mother with the toddler nodded grimly, as if recalling her own experiences with medical gatekeeping. Dr. Morrison ran his hand through his hair again, a gesture I was beginning to recognize as his way of processing stress. "Dr. Chen, Colonel Hayes, could we perhaps continue this conversation in my office? I think we need to address these concerns properly." "Actually," said a new voice from near the reception desk, "I think this conversation needs to happen right here, where everyone can hear it." We all turned to see a man in his 60s rising from a chair near the window. He was tall and lean, with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. He wore a simple blue work shirt and jeans, but something about his posture reminded me of the parade ground. "I'm Tom Rodriguez," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable cadence of military command. "Master Sergeant, retired, 28 years, Army Rangers." He looked directly at me. "Colonel, with your permission, I'd like to say something." I nodded, curious about where this was heading. Tom Rodriguez stepped into the center of the room, his presence immediately commanding the same kind of attention that Dr. Morrison had garnered earlier. "I've been coming to this clinic for 3 years," he said, his voice steady and clear. "My wife has diabetes, and we're here every month for her medication checks. In those 3 years, I've watched the staff here treat people differently based on how they're dressed, what kind of car they drive, whether they speak English with an accent." He gestured toward the front desk, where Brittany and Margaret stood frozen in mortified silence. "Last month, I watched that young lady there refuse to see a Hispanic family because their insurance card was expired by 2 days. The little girl had an ear infection that was making her cry, but they were sent away to come back with proper documentation." Tom's voice grew harder. 2 weeks ago, I saw an elderly black gentleman charged $150 in cash for a blood pressure check because they claimed they couldn't verify his Medicare information. When I asked the billing supervisor about it later, she said their system was having technical difficulties with certain types of insurance. The waiting room was silent, except for the soft whir of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside. I could see uncomfortable shifts in posture, the recognition of patterns that individuals might have dismissed as isolated incidents. "But today," Tom continued, his eyes finding mine across the room, I watched them try that same game on a woman who spent over 2 decades defending this country, a doctor who's probably saved more lives than anyone in this building. And when she didn't back down, when she refused to be intimidated, they made her pay cash anyway. Dr. Chen pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, would you be willing to provide a formal statement about these incidents? Because what you're describing isn't just poor customer service. It's a pattern of discriminatory practices that could constitute healthcare fraud. Dr. Morrison's face had gone ashen. Now wait just a minute. These are serious allegations, and I think we need to be careful about… About what? Tom Rodriguez's voice cut through the doctor's protests like a blade. About telling the truth? About holding people accountable for treating patients like criminals based on the color of their skin or the clothes they wear? Another voice joined the conversation, this one from a woman in her 40s sitting near the children's play area. I was here 2 months ago with my son for his sports physical, she said, standing up slowly. We have excellent insurance through my husband's engineering firm, but because I came straight from my housekeeping job at the hotel, still in my uniform, they made me wait 3 hours. Families who arrived after us were seen first, and when I asked about the delay, they claimed there had been a scheduling error. That's not true. Brittany finally spoke up, her voice shaky but defiant. We see patients in order of arrival, and we treat everyone equally. These accusations are… Documented, Dr. Chen interrupted, holding up her phone. I've been recording this entire conversation, and I've already forwarded the audio to the State Medical Board's discrimination hotline. She looked around the room. Anyone else who's experienced differential treatment here should know that there are legal protections in place for healthcare discrimination. The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. What had started as a simple acknowledgement of my military service had evolved into something much larger, a community reckoning with patterns of bias they'd all witnessed but perhaps hadn't felt empowered to challenge individually. Dr. Morrison stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture that was part surrender, part plea for calm. Please, everyone, let's take a step back here. I understand there are concerns, and I want to address them appropriately, but this isn't the right forum for that. This is exactly the right forum, said another voice, and we all turned to see the woman who'd been turned away earlier with her sick child. She was standing in the clinic doorway, her son still at her side, but now she was accompanied by a man in a suit carrying a briefcase. Mrs. Gonzalez, Dr. Morrison said, his voice carefully neutral, I thought you had left. I did leave, she replied, her English clear and precise despite the accent that Brittany had apparently found so problematic. I went to get my insurance card, as your staff demanded, but I also went to get my husband. She gestured to the man beside her. Dr. Gonzalez is an attorney with the State Civil Rights Commission. Dr. Gonzalez stepped forward, his expression professionally grave. Dr. Morrison, I'm here because my wife called me about the treatment she received this morning. When she described being turned away despite having valid insurance, I became concerned that this might represent a pattern of discriminatory practices. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a tablet, consulting notes that he'd apparently been taking. In the past hour, I've received calls from Dr. Chen, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, and 2 other individuals describing similar incidents at this clinic. The state takes healthcare discrimination very seriously, especially when it appears to target specific demographic groups. Dr. Morrison's professional composure was beginning to crack.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Gonzalez, I assure you that any misunderstandings that occurred today were isolated incidents. Our staff receives regular training on non-discrimination policies, and we pride ourselves on serving all members of our community. Isolated incidents? Tom Rodriguez repeated, his voice heavy with skepticism. Is that what you call charging a decorated military officer $125 cash for a $65 flu shot because your staff decided her military medical card wasn't real insurance? The room buzzed with quiet conversation as the financial details of my treatment sank in. I could see other patients exchanging glances, perhaps remembering their own experiences with unexplained charges or payment demands that had seemed excessive at the time. Dr. Chen looked up from her phone. "Colonel Hayes, did they really charge you $125 for a flu shot?" I nodded, feeling heat rise in my cheeks again. $65 for the shot, $20 for an administrative fee, and $40 for an office visit charge. "That's highway robbery," said the woman who'd shared her own story about delayed service. "My husband's insurance was billed $18 for my son's flu shot last year." Dr. Gonzalez made more notes on his tablet. Differential pricing based on payment method can constitute financial discrimination, especially when the higher cash prices appear to be applied selectively. He looked directly at Dr. Morrison. "Doctor, I'm going to need to see your billing policies and fee schedules, as well as any training materials your staff receives regarding insurance verification." "This is getting out of hand." Margaret, the supervisor, finally spoke up. "We have other patients waiting to be seen, and this disruption is affecting our ability to provide care." "What's affecting your ability to provide care," Dr. Chen said sharply, "is a front desk staff that's more concerned with playing insurance investigator than with actually helping sick people." The young mother with the toddler stood up again, her child balanced on her hip. "I want to know something," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "How many people have been turned away from this clinic because they couldn't prove they belonged here? How many children went without care because their parents didn't look like they could afford it?" "That's not how we operate," Dr. Morrison insisted, but his protest sounded weak in the face of mounting evidence to the contrary. "Then explain this," Tom Rodriguez said, pulling out his own phone. "I've been recording interactions here for the past 6 months because I suspected something was wrong. Let me play you a conversation from August." The audio quality was muffled, but the voices were clear enough. Brittany's voice, unmistakably, rejecting a patient's insurance and demanding cash payment. Then another recording, this one from September, of the same staff member explaining to someone that their Medicaid card would need to be verified before any services could be provided. Medicaid verification that somehow takes 3 to 4 hours for some patients and 15 minutes for others, Tom added grimly. Dr. Morrison closed his eyes, and when he opened them, I could see the weight of realization settling on his shoulders. "I had no idea," he said quietly. "I spend most of my time with patients in the exam rooms. I trusted my front office staff to handle insurance and billing appropriately." "Trust, but verify," I said, speaking for the first time in several minutes. "It's a principle we use in the military. You can trust your people to do their jobs, but you still need systems in place to ensure standards are being met." Dr. Gonzalez nodded approvingly. "Colonel Hayes raises an excellent point. Healthcare practices have a legal and ethical obligation to ensure that their staff are following non-discrimination policies, not just assuming that they are." Dr. Chen looked around the room, taking in the faces of patients who'd been silently enduring substandard treatment. "The question now is what we do about it. Dr. Morrison, I appreciate that you may not have been aware of these issues, but ignorance isn't an excuse when people's health and dignity are at stake." "You're absolutely right," Dr. Morrison said, his voice carrying a new note of resolve. "This needs to be addressed immediately and comprehensively." He turned to face Brittany and Margaret, who had remained silent throughout the increasingly damaging revelations. "Brittany, Margaret, I need you both in my office immediately. We're going to review every policy, every procedure, and every patient interaction from the past 6 months." His voice was firm, carrying the authority of someone who'd finally recognized the scope of the problem he was facing. Dr. Gonzalez consulted his tablet again. "Dr. Morrison, I appreciate your willingness to address these issues internally, but given the pattern of discriminatory behavior that's been documented here today, the State Civil Rights Commission will need to conduct its own investigation." "I understand," Dr. Morrison replied. "We'll cooperate fully with any investigation. But I also want to take immediate action to ensure this never happens again." He turned to address the room more broadly. To every patient who has experienced discriminatory treatment at this clinic, I offer my personal apology. What happened here today, and apparently on many other occasions, is completely unacceptable and contrary to everything I believe healthcare should represent. Tom Rodriguez crossed his arms over his chest. Apologies are a start, doctor, but what are you going to do to fix the system that allowed this to happen? Several things, Dr. Morrison said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. First, effective immediately, any patient who was overcharged or denied service inappropriately will receive a full refund and free follow-up care. Second, our entire front office staff will undergo comprehensive retraining on non-discrimination policies and cultural sensitivity. Third, we're implementing a patient advocate position to ensure that anyone who feels they've been treated unfairly has a direct avenue for addressing their concerns. Dr. Chen looked skeptical. Those are good steps, but how do we know they'll actually be implemented? How do we know this won't just blow over once the attention dies down? Because I'm going to personally oversee every aspect of this reform process, Dr. Morrison said. And because I'm going to invite community oversight to ensure we're held accountable for the changes we promised to make. Mrs. Gonzalez, who had been quietly listening to the exchange, stepped forward. Dr. Morrison, my son still needs to be seen for his cough. Will that be a problem now? Absolutely not, Dr. Morrison said immediately. In fact, I'll examine him personally and there will be no charge for today's visit. He looked around the room.
That goes for anyone who was turned away or overcharged. We need to start rebuilding trust, and that begins with making things right for the people we've wronged. I felt a tap on my shoulder and turned to see the elderly veteran with the baseball cap standing beside me. Up close, I could see the ribbons pinned to his cap. Vietnam service, Purple Heart, Bronze Star. His weathered face was kind but serious. "Colonel," he said quietly, "I want you to know that what you did here today took real courage. It would have been easier to just pay the money and walk away, but you stood your ground. That matters." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely moved by his words. But I didn't set out to make a statement. I just wanted to be treated fairly. "Sometimes that's the same thing," he said with a smile. "Sometimes asking to be treated fairly is the most radical thing you can do." Dr. Chen approached us, her phone still in her hand. "Colonel Hayes, I hope you don't mind, but I've documented everything that happened here today. The medical community needs to know that this kind of discrimination is still happening, and that there are consequences for healthcare providers who allow it to continue." "I don't mind," I said. "If sharing my story helps other people get better treatment, then something good will have come from all this." Dr. Morrison rejoined our conversation, looking drained but determined. "Colonel Hayes, I want you to know that we're going to refund your payment immediately, and I'd like to invite you to serve on our new Community Oversight Board. Your perspective as both a healthcare provider and someone who experienced discrimination here would be invaluable." I considered his offer carefully. Part of me just wanted to leave, to put this entire experience behind me and focus on preparing for my deployment. "I'll consider it," I said finally. "But I deploy in 3 weeks, so my availability will be limited." "Even a few sessions would be helpful," Dr. Morrison said, "and perhaps we could arrange for remote participation once you're overseas." Dr. Gonzalez closed his tablet and returned it to his briefcase. "Dr. Morrison, I'll be in touch within the next few days to schedule interviews with your staff and review your policies. In the meantime, I'd suggest you begin documenting all the changes you've promised to make. The state will want to see concrete evidence of reform, not just good intentions." "Understood," Dr. Morrison replied. "I'll have our initial reform plan ready for your review by the end of the week." As the formal conversation began to wind down, I noticed that the waiting room had gradually emptied of its original patients. Some had been called back for their appointments, others had apparently left during the commotion. But several people had remained, drawn by the unfolding drama and its implications for their own healthcare experiences. The woman who'd shared her story about delayed service approached me as I prepared to leave. "I just wanted to thank you," she said quietly. "I've been coming here for 5 years, and I've seen the way they treat different people differently. I always felt like I was being paranoid, like maybe I was imagining things." "You weren't imagining anything," I assured her, "and you weren't paranoid. Trust your instincts when something doesn't feel right.
Tom Rodriguez shook my hand firmly before I left. "Colonel, it's been an honor meeting you. What you did today reminded me why I served. To protect the idea that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." As I walked toward the exit, I passed Brittany at the front desk. She was sitting quietly, staring at her computer screen, but she looked up as I approached. "Colonel Hayes," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. I'm really, really sorry." I stopped and looked at her, this young woman who'd treated me so dismissively just an hour earlier. Her makeup was smudged from tears, and her hands were shaking slightly. "I didn't know," she continued. "I mean, I knew what I was doing was wrong, but I didn't know who you were, what you'd done, what you sacrificed." "That's exactly the point," I said gently. "You shouldn't have to know who I am to treat me with respect. Every person who walks through that door deserves basic human dignity, regardless of their appearance, their accent, or their insurance status." She nodded, tears spilling over. "I understand that now. I really do." I walked out of the Riverside Family Health Clinic into the crisp October afternoon, but I could feel that this wasn't over. The reverberations of what had happened would continue to spread, touching lives and changing systems in ways I couldn't yet imagine. 3 days later, I was sitting in my small apartment in Cedar Falls, reviewing deployment checklists and medical protocols when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local. "Colonel Hayes? This is Janet Morrison, Dr. Morrison's wife. I hope you don't mind me calling, but my husband gave me your number. I wanted to speak with you personally." I set down my checklist, curious about this unexpected contact. "Of course, Mrs. Morrison. How can I help you?" "Actually, I'm calling to see how I can help you," she said, her voice warm but serious. "David came home Tuesday night and told me what happened at the clinic. He was devastated, Colonel Hayes, absolutely devastated. He's been practicing medicine for 18 years, and he had no idea that his staff was treating patients the way they were treating you." She paused, and I could hear her taking a shaky breath. "I'm calling because I want you to know that David hasn't slept properly since Tuesday. He's been at the clinic every day until midnight, reviewing patient files, interviewing staff, and rebuilding their entire intake process from the ground up." "Mrs. Morrison, I appreciate you telling me this, but your husband doesn't need to." "Yes, he does," she interrupted gently. "We have 3 children, Colonel Hayes. Our oldest daughter is applying to West Point next year. She wants to serve her country just like you have." When David told me how you were treated, I thought about her walking into a place where she might be judged by her appearance rather than her character, and it broke my heart. I found myself smiling despite the seriousness of the conversation. "Your daughter sounds like she has excellent parents. West Point will be lucky to have her." "That's kind of you to say, but Colonel, there's something else. David wanted me to ask if you'd be willing to meet with our entire medical staff, not just the front office people, but the doctors, nurses, physician assistants, everyone. He wants them to hear directly from you about what happened and why it matters." I considered the request carefully. In 2 weeks, I'd be on a plane to Kuwait, and I had a mountain of preparation still ahead of me. But the opportunity to help prevent other patients from experiencing what I'd gone through was compelling. "I think I could arrange that," I said finally. "When were you thinking?" "Would this Saturday morning work? David has arranged for the clinic to be closed to patients so the entire staff can attend. He's calling it mandatory cultural competency training, but really, he wants everyone to understand the human impact of their actions." I considered the request carefully. In 2 weeks, I'd be on a plane to Kuwait, and I had a mountain of preparation still ahead of me. But the opportunity to help prevent other patients from experiencing what I'd gone through was compelling. "I think I could arrange that," I said finally. "When were you thinking?" "Would this Saturday morning work? David has arranged for the clinic to be closed to patients so the entire staff can attend. He's calling it mandatory cultural competency training, but really, he wants everyone to understand the human impact of their actions." Saturday morning found me walking back into the Riverside Family Health Clinic, but this time the experience was completely different. Dr. Morrison met me at the door personally, greeting me with the respect and professionalism that should have been standard from the beginning. The waiting room had been reconfigured with chairs arranged in a large circle, and about 20 staff members were present, from receptionists to physicians. Brittany was there, sitting in the back row, her eyes red-rimmed and her posture defensive. Margaret, the supervisor, sat beside her, looking equally uncomfortable. But the overall atmosphere wasn't hostile. It felt more like a medical conference or educational seminar. "Thank you all for being here," Dr. Morrison began, standing in the center of the circle. "Today, we're going to have an honest conversation about patient care, bias, and the responsibility we have as healthcare providers to treat every person who walks through our doors with dignity and respect." He gestured toward me. "Colonel Rebecca Hayes has graciously agreed to share her experience with us, not to embarrass anyone or assign blame, but to help us understand how our actions affect the people we're supposed to be helping." I stood up, looking around the room at faces that ranged from genuinely curious to obviously uncomfortable. "I'm not here to lecture anyone," I began. "I'm here because I believe that healthcare workers, like military personnel, enter their profession with the genuine desire to help people. But sometimes systems and assumptions can get in the way of that mission." I told them about my experience, but I also talked about the broader implications of healthcare discrimination. I shared statistics about differential treatment based on race, gender, age, and socioeconomic status. I described how bias in medical settings can literally be a matter of life and death, affecting everything from pain management to diagnostic accuracy. When I was turned away initially and then overcharged for basic service, it wasn't just about the money or the inconvenience, I explained. It was about being made to feel like I didn't belong in a place that's supposed to provide healing to everyone. A young nurse raised her hand. "Colonel Hayes, can you help us understand what we should have done differently? I mean, we do have policies about insurance verification, and sometimes people do try to use fraudulent cards." "That's a fair question," I replied. "The issue isn't that you verify insurance. That's a legitimate business practice. The issue is when verification becomes an interrogation, when assumptions are made based on appearance, and when policies are applied inconsistently depending on how a patient looks or sounds." Dr. Morrison stepped forward. "Since Tuesday, we've reviewed 6 months of patient interactions, and we've found troubling patterns. Patients with certain types of names or accents were more likely to be asked for additional documentation. Cash payment was demanded more frequently from patients who appeared to be of lower socioeconomic status. Insurance verification that typically takes 15 minutes somehow took hours for specific demographic groups." Brittany shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Finally, she raised her hand. "Colonel Hayes, I need to ask you something. Are you going to sue us? Because everyone's been talking about lawsuits and investigations, and I'm scared I'm going to lose my job." The room fell silent, waiting for my response. I could see genuine fear in her eyes, but also something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "Brittany, I'm not interested in suing anyone," I said. "I'm interested in making sure that the next person who doesn't look like what you expect a doctor or a colonel or a valued patient to look like gets treated with the same respect you'd give to your own family members." Relief flooded her face, but I wasn't done. "However, that doesn't mean there won't be consequences for discriminatory behavior. Dr. Gonzalez from the Civil Rights Commission is still conducting his investigation, and other patients have filed formal complaints. The goal isn't punishment for its own sake, it's accountability and change." Margaret, the supervisor, spoke up for the first time. "What kind of changes are you talking about, specifically?" Dr. Morrison consulted a tablet. "We're implementing several new policies. First, all front desk interactions will be monitored and recorded for quality assurance. Second, any patient who feels they've been treated unfairly can request an immediate review by a senior staff member. Third, we're establishing clear, written protocols for insurance verification that must be applied consistently to all patients." He looked around the room. We're also partnering with the Cedar Falls Community Health Center to provide free translation services, and we're establishing a financial assistance program for patients who need help with payment but don't qualify for traditional aid programs. A physician assistant near the front raised her hand. "Dr. Morrison, these changes sound expensive. How are we going to fund them?" "By doing the right thing," Dr. Morrison replied firmly. "We've calculated that the discriminatory practices we've been discussing have actually cost us money in lost patients, negative reviews, and now potential legal liability. Treating people fairly isn't just morally correct, it's good business." The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, covering everything from unconscious bias training to community outreach programs. As the session wound down, several staff members approached me individually to ask questions or share their own observations about problematic practices they'd witnessed. A nurse named Patricia, who appeared to be in her 50s, pulled me aside near the end. "Colonel Hayes, I've been working here for 8 years, and I've seen things that bothered me, but I never felt like I had the authority to speak up. After Tuesday, I realized that staying silent made me complicit." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean, I've watched Brittany and Margaret treat certain patients for years. I told myself it wasn't my job to police the front desk, but when I saw how you handled the situation with dignity and strength, I realized I could have been standing up for patients all along." Her words stayed with me as I left the clinic that Saturday afternoon. Change wasn't just happening in policies and procedures, it was happening in the hearts and minds of individual healthcare workers who were recognizing their own power to make a difference. The following Tuesday, exactly 1 week after my original clinic visit, I received a call from Dr.
Chen at Cedar Falls Memorial. "Colonel Hayes, I wanted to give you an update on the investigation. Dr. Gonzalez has interviewed 12 current and former patients of the Riverside Clinic, and 8 of them reported experiencing discriminatory treatment." 8 out of 12? I said, shocked by the percentage. The pattern was even clearer than we initially suspected. But here's the interesting part. Since news of your confrontation spread through the community, 15 other patients have come forward with complaints about healthcare discrimination at various facilities throughout the area. She paused to let that sink in. "Colonel, what happened at Riverside wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem in our healthcare system. But because you spoke up, because you refused to accept substandard treatment, you've created space for other people to share their stories." Over the next week, as I continued my deployment preparations, I received several more calls and emails from people who'd heard about the clinic incident. Some were veterans sharing their own experiences with medical discrimination. Others were healthcare workers who wanted to implement similar reforms at their own facilities. One call particularly moved me. It came from Maria Gonzalez, the mother whose sick child had been turned away on the same morning I was mistreated. "Colonel Hayes," she said, her accent adding warmth to her words, "I wanted to thank you for what you did. Not just for speaking up in the moment, but for creating change that will help other families like mine." She went on to explain that her husband's civil rights investigation had resulted in new state guidelines for healthcare discrimination reporting. "My son is better now," she said, "but more importantly, the next child who comes to that clinic won't be turned away because of how their family looks or sounds." The most unexpected contact came from Tom Rodriguez, the retired master sergeant who'd supported me during the confrontation. He called to invite me to speak at a veterans support group meeting. "Colonel, we've got about 30 veterans who meet monthly to talk about transition issues, healthcare advocacy, that sort of thing. After what happened at the clinic, several of them realized they'd been accepting substandard medical treatment because they didn't think they had the right to demand better." I agreed to attend the meeting, which was held in the basement of a local church on a Thursday evening. The group was diverse, men and women ranging from their 20s to their 70s, representing conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan. What united them was a shared experience of feeling invisible or dismissed in civilian healthcare settings. "The thing is," explained a young woman who'd served in Iraq, "we're trained to adapt and overcome, to make do with whatever we're given. But that mindset can work against us when we're dealing with healthcare providers who think veterans are looking for handouts or special treatment." An older man nodded vigorously.
I've been going to the same family doctor for 10 years, and he still talks to me like I might be faking my PTSD symptoms. Last month, he suggested that maybe I was exaggerating my anxiety to get disability benefits. As I listened to their stories, I realized that my experience at the Riverside Clinic was part of a much larger pattern of medical discrimination affecting veterans, minorities, women, and anyone who didn't fit healthcare providers' assumptions about worthy patients. What you all need to understand, I told the group, is that you have rights as patients that go beyond whatever the staff feels like providing. You have the right to respectful treatment, clear communication about costs, and care that's based on medical need rather than personal bias. Tom Rodriguez leaned forward in his chair. Colonel, what you did at that clinic gave all of us permission to expect better. Before that day, I thought the way they treated different people was just how things worked. Now I know it's something we can change. The week before my deployment, I attended one final meeting at the Riverside Clinic. Dr. Morrison had invited me to observe their new patient intake process and provide feedback on the changes they'd implemented. The transformation was remarkable. The waiting room featured new signage in multiple languages explaining patient rights and the complaint process. The front desk staff had been expanded to include a patient advocate, and all interactions were being monitored by supervisory staff. I watched as a young Hispanic mother brought her toddler in for a wellness check. The interaction with the front desk was professional, respectful, and efficient. The staff member verified insurance quickly and explained all costs up front. When the mother mentioned that English wasn't her first language, she was immediately offered translation services. It's like watching a completely different organization, Dr. Morrison said quietly as we observed from his office. The staff initially resisted the changes, but they're beginning to see that treating patients with dignity actually makes their jobs easier, not harder. Brittany, who had received additional training and was being closely supervised, approached us during a quiet moment. Colonel Hayes, I wanted to tell you something before you deploy. What happened that first day, I've been thinking about it every single day since then. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I realized that I was treating people the way I thought I was supposed to treat them, based on what other staff members had taught me. But nobody ever explained why we did things that way, or whether it was right. Her voice grew stronger. I'm going back to school to become a nurse, and I promise you that I'll never treat a patient the way I treated you, never. 3 days later, I was on a military transport plane headed for Kuwait. But the story of the Riverside Clinic continued without me. Dr. Chen sent regular updates about the ongoing civil rights investigation and the policy changes being implemented at healthcare facilities throughout the region. 6 weeks into my deployment, while treating patients at a field hospital outside Kuwait City, I received an email that made me smile despite the exhaustion of a 15-hour surgery shift. It was from Dr. Morrison, with the subject line, Progress Report. The message included photos of a new community health fair that the Riverside Clinic was hosting in partnership with local immigrant services organizations. The pictures showed healthcare providers offering free screenings, vaccinations, and health education to families who might otherwise avoid seeking medical care due to cost or language barriers. Colonel Hayes, his message read, I wanted you to see the direct result of your courage that Tuesday morning. We're now serving 40% more patients from underserved communities, and our patient satisfaction scores have improved dramatically. More importantly, we've become the kind of healthcare facility that my children can be proud of. The most meaningful update came from Tom Rodriguez, who'd been elected president of the Veterans Support Group. His message included a photo of the group at a statewide Veterans Healthcare Advocacy Conference, where they'd presented a workshop on patient rights and self-advocacy. Colonel, he wrote, you taught us that demanding respect isn't selfish, it's necessary. We're now helping veterans throughout the state understand their rights and find their voices in healthcare settings. But the message that brought tears to my eyes came from an unexpected source. It was from a woman named Jennifer Kim, whom I'd never met. She explained that she was a medical student who'd read about the clinic incident in a healthcare discrimination case study that was now being taught at medical schools throughout the region. I'm writing to tell you that your story has become part of our medical ethics curriculum, she explained. Future doctors are learning about unconscious bias, patient advocacy, and the importance of treating every person with dignity, regardless of their appearance or circumstances. She went on to describe how medical schools were implementing new requirements for cultural competency training and bias recognition. 20 years from now, the doctors treating patients will have learned from what you experienced. You've literally changed medical education. On my last night in Kuwait, as I prepared to return home after 6 months of deployment, I reflected on the ripple effects of that single morning at a small-town clinic. What had started as a simple request for a flu shot had evolved into systematic changes in healthcare delivery, medical education, and community advocacy. I thought about Brittany, now working her way through nursing school with a new understanding of patient dignity. I thought about Dr. Morrison, who transformed his practice from a place that excluded certain patients to one that actively welcomed the most vulnerable members of the community. I thought about the veterans who'd found their voices and the patients who'd learned to advocate for themselves. Most importantly, I thought about the children who would grow up in a world where healthcare discrimination was increasingly recognized and challenged, where medical providers were trained to see their own biases and work actively to counteract them. When my plane touched down at Cedar Falls Regional Airport, I was greeted by a small group of people I'd come to consider friends. Tom Rodriguez was there, along with Dr.
Chen, Maria Gonzalez and her family, and several members of the Veterans Support Group. They held a simple sign that read, "Welcome home, Colonel Hayes." As I walked through the terminal, Tom fell into step behind me. "Colonel, there's something you need to know. The Riverside Clinic isn't the only place that's changed." The story spread beyond our community. Healthcare facilities in 12 states have implemented new anti-discrimination policies based on what happened here. He handed me a folder filled with newspaper clippings, medical journal articles, and policy documents. "Your story became a case study in healthcare civil rights law. Law schools are teaching it, medical schools are studying it, and patient advocacy groups are using it to train people to stand up for themselves." Dr. Chan approached as we neared the baggage claim. "Colonel, I have a question for you. The State Medical Board is looking for someone to head up a new healthcare discrimination prevention task force. It would involve developing training materials, investigating complaints, and working with medical facilities to improve their practices." She smiled. "The position is part-time and flexible enough to accommodate your military duties. Interested?" I looked around at the faces of people who'd become advocates and change-makers because they'd witnessed one moment of standing up for dignity. The answer was easy. When do I start? 6 months later, the Hayes Protocol had become standard practice in healthcare facilities throughout the Midwest. Named not after me, but after the principle that every patient, named Hayes or Johnson or Rodriguez or Chen or any other name, deserved identical, respectful treatment regardless of their appearance or circumstances. The protocol required healthcare providers to examine their own biases, implement consistent policies for all patients, and create clear channels for reporting discriminatory treatment. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't solve every problem, but it created a framework for accountability that hadn't existed before. Sometimes, change begins with a single moment of refusing to accept less than basic human dignity. Sometimes, it starts with someone in a gray sweatshirt and worn sneakers who happens to be a colonel, or a doctor, or simply a human being who knows her worth and isn't afraid to insist that others recognize it too. The flu shot I went to get that Tuesday morning cost me $125 in cash, but it ended up being worth far more than I ever could have imagined. Not because of what I received, but because of what I refused to accept, and what that refusal made possible for everyone who came after me. In quiet moments, I still think about that waiting room, about the faces of patients who'd been watching and waiting for someone to say that their treatment wasn't acceptable. I think about Brittany, now helping other young healthcare workers understand that policies are only as good as the compassion with which they're applied. I think about Dr. Morrison, who discovered that acknowledging failure can be the first step toward meaningful success. Most of all, I think about the children who will grow up in a world where healthcare discrimination is increasingly rare, not because it was wished away, but because enough people decided to stand up and say that everyone deserves better. That's a legacy worth far more than the cost of any medical treatment, and it's proof that sometimes the most powerful changes begin with the simplest acts of courage. 2 years after that transformative morning at the Riverside Clinic, I found myself standing before a congressional subcommittee on healthcare access, testifying about systematic discrimination in medical settings. The hearing room was packed with advocates, medical professionals, and families who'd experienced the kind of treatment I'd encountered that Tuesday morning in Cedar Falls. Senators, I began, looking across the panel of lawmakers, healthcare discrimination isn't just about individual acts of bias. It's about systems that allow those acts to flourish unchecked and the collective responsibility we all share to demand better. Behind me sat Tom Rodriguez, now a national veterans healthcare advocate. Dr. Chen had taken a position with the Department of Health and Human Services, leading federal efforts to combat medical discrimination. Maria Gonzalez worked as a community health liaison, helping immigrant families navigate healthcare systems with confidence and dignity. The ripple effects continued to spread in ways none of us had anticipated. Medical schools across the country now required courses in patient advocacy and bias recognition. The Hayes Protocol had been adopted by healthcare systems in 37 states. Most remarkably, patient advocacy groups were reporting a significant increase in individuals speaking up when they experienced discriminatory treatment. During a recess in the hearings, I received a text message that made me smile. It was from Brittany, who'd graduated nursing school the previous month. "Colonel Hayes, just wanted you to know I got the job at Cedar Falls Memorial. Dr. Chen hired me for their new patient advocacy department. Thought you'd want to know that the girl who treated you so badly is now fighting to make sure it never happens to anyone else." Her message included a photo of her in scrubs standing beside a sign that read, "Patient Rights Advocate." The transformation from the defensive young woman I'd encountered at the clinic to this confident healthcare professional embodied everything we'd hoped the broader changes could achieve. Later that evening, I attended a dinner hosted by the American Medical Association for Healthcare Reform Advocates. The keynote speaker was Dr. Morrison, who'd become a national leader in patient-centered care reform. His clinic now served as a model for inclusive healthcare practices, hosting visiting medical professionals from around the world who wanted to study their transformation. "The most important lesson we learned," he told the audience, "is that change doesn't require perfect people or perfect systems. It requires honest acknowledgement of our failures and the courage to do better." As the dinner concluded, I was approached by a young woman who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Kim, the medical student who'd written to me during my deployment. She was now a resident at Johns Hopkins, specializing in emergency medicine. "Colonel Hayes, I wanted to thank you for something specific," she said. "Last month, I witnessed an attending physician treating a homeless patient dismissively. Because of your story, because of what I learned in medical school about patient advocacy, I spoke up. That patient received proper care, and that attending physician reflected on his own biases." She paused, her eyes bright with conviction. "Your moment of standing up for yourself has created thousands of moments where medical professionals stand up for their patients. That's a legacy that goes far beyond any individual story." As I prepared to leave Washington and return to my duties at Fort Campbell, I reflected on how one morning's determination to be treated with dignity had evolved into a national conversation about healthcare equity. The changes weren't perfect, and discrimination hadn't been eliminated, but the conversation had shifted fundamentally. Patients now knew they had rights, and advocates supporting those rights. Healthcare workers received training to recognize and address their own biases. Medical institutions faced accountability for discriminatory practices. Most importantly, the culture of silence that had allowed such treatment to persist was being replaced by one that encouraged speaking up and standing together. The final validation came 6 months later when I received a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs. They were implementing comprehensive anti-discrimination protocols across all VA medical facilities, using principles developed from our work in Iowa. The letter was signed by the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, who wrote, "Colonel Hayes, your service to veterans continues long after you hung up your uniform. Thank you for showing us all what it means to defend dignity." I never did get that simple flu shot I originally went for that Tuesday morning. By the time all the meetings and reforms and investigations were complete, flu season had passed. But what I gained was something far more valuable than protection from seasonal illness.
I gained the knowledge that speaking up for yourself can create space for others to find their voices, and that demanding basic respect can spark changes that touch lives across the country. The young woman in the gray sweatshirt who walked into the Riverside Clinic that morning just wanted to be treated fairly. She ended up helping to redefine what fair treatment looks like in healthcare settings throughout America. Sometimes the most powerful changes begin not with grand gestures or elaborate plans, but with the simple refusal to accept anything less than the dignity every human being deserves. The story didn't end when the clinic reformed its practices or when the protocols were implemented nationwide. It continues every time a patient advocates for themselves, every time a healthcare worker chooses compassion over assumption, and every time someone stands up for what's right, even when it would be easier to walk away. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.